Good morning. My name is David Howard. I'm Vice President of Corporate Strategy for Pavo. I have two folks with me here today on the webinar that are going to talk about food safety and agriculture and relate that to what we're doing here at Pavo. This webinar is being recorded and we will make that recording available. We expect to take about 30 minutes to go through the discussion with the panelists here. Both of our panelists today are advisors with Pavo. So let me quickly introduce first David Dahl. David is a farm advisor for the University of California, and his work in research-based technologies and farm research extends directly to approximately 1,500 tree nut farmers within Merced County within California. Further, 9,000 farmers throughout the state of California are exposed to David's developed content and his work through presentations and other forms of media. David's work within his role includes applying concepts of horticulture, plant pathology, entomology, soil and irrigation science, and sustainable agriculture. Welcome, David.
Hello.
Hi. I also have with us another Pavo advisor, Dr. Darin Detwiler. He is the Assistant Dean at Northeastern University's College of Professional Studies. His work at the university includes quality assurance supervision for all undergraduate and graduate programs. He is also a professor of food regulatory policy, responsible for the development and instruction of courses related to food safety, global economics of food and agriculture, and food policy for graduate students who work in the food industry. He additionally advises industry and government agencies, such as the FDA and USDA and state agencies, addressing food safety and authenticity issues in the US and abroad. Welcome, Dr. Detwiler.
Thank you, and good to meet you, David.
Good, thank you. So let's,
and David.
David, yes, sorry, David and David, yes. So let's jump right in. David, can you just start? I was intrigued when I first got introduced to you. I learned a new word, pomology. Can you just explain for our audience what pomology is?
Yeah, very simply, pomology is the study of fruit and the art of producing that fruit, or the science of producing that fruit. So with that, we study a variety of aspects from rootstocks, which is the bottom part of the tree, which often is genetically different than the top part of the tree. We also study the top part of the tree, from effects of pruning and different training characteristics to the use of let's say, growth regulators or other types of compounds to accelerate the development of that type of fruit, to get it to the size, thinning, carbohydrate balance, a wide variety of internal physiological processes that can actually influence the size as well as the number of fruit that are being produced on a tree.
Thank you. And Dr. Detwiler, could you take a moment to let us know what you're working on, your current research in your field?
Sure. Essentially, I study the history of change in food, whether that be behavior, change in technology, change in policy over time. I also have a significant research interest in looking at how states are able to implement federal food policy, what are the barriers or the obstacles, the differences between different jurisdictions. And that also applies to international food policies as well, with so many political and geographical lines between, from farm to fork. Finally, my most recent research has been in blockchain and looking at corporate culture within the food industry, the food supply chain, both as it exists now and how it might exist with blockchain or related technologies.
Thanks. And would you have any direct intersection with David's work in the Central Valley with almonds?
Strangely enough, when we started talking about dry goods and other foods, 25 years ago, my work was really around meat, but a simple scan of recent headlines in terms of outbreaks and recalls, you barely ever see meat anymore. It has to do with everything from produce to dry goods and even nuts. So looking at how various industries interpret these regulations, work within supply chains, but also you have so many commercially packaged goods and ready-to-eat goods that have, whether it be nuts or other products, in a multi-ingredient recipe. It's impossible to just focus on any one commodity or sector within the industry.
Right. And quickly, is the livestock industry done something more or better with technology that's reduced the number of outbreaks associated with that? So is there a lesson for the rest of the ag industry there?
To some extent, if we look at the fact that 25 years ago, after the landmark Jack-in-the-Box E. coli outbreak, most policy change and most scientific change was driven by that need in the meat industry. But as we've seen over the course of the last 25 years, not only was USDA policy and USDA science and inspection technology in need of being updated, but the FDA, other non-meat industry sectors had to look at changing their policy, changing the inspection science, and at the same time, even in the last 25 years, not only has technology changed, but consumer preferences changed. What monies we spend, where we spend, what types of food we're buying, and this is requiring a significant amount of change within the science or the regulatory or reg tech science that we see today. So it's not just any one sector, but I think that as multiple sectors are involved in this change in technology, we're seeing wider applications throughout the entire food supply chain, not just for any one commodity.
Okay. David, I want to come back to you, and I want to tap into the regulations, the California regulations issue around water. But before we get there, could you just brief our audience a bit how to think about almond farming, the scale, size of orchards, and other tree nut products, just to kind of give some background and context to the work you do and help people understand just how productive California is in that space?
Yeah, sure. So California almond production is about 80% of the world's production of almonds. Our number 2, number 3 competitors include Australia and Spain, which produce about 8% of the world's crop respectively each. And then the rest is picked up by Chile, Turkey, South Africa, a little bit in Portugal, as well as scattered throughout the rest of the Mediterranean climates. Now that key is the Mediterranean climate. It's typified by low rainfall in season, relatively warm conditions throughout the summer, actually relatively hot conditions, often ranging between 35 to 40 degrees centigrade, or looking at somewhere between 90 and 105, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. We flip that over to the winter time, and it tends to be relatively a mild winter. I wouldn't say cold, but it's somewhere in around 40 to 50 degrees during the day, 4 to 8 degrees in Celsius or centigrade. And then also characterized by having relatively heavy rainfall and high chill that we tend to accumulate in that winter period. So that's that Mediterranean climate. It tends to be defined to relatively few locations across the world. And that's very unique to being successful in producing almonds. Now, carrying that over, the entire Central Valley, essentially all of California is within that climate zone, especially the northern half of it. But what we're predominantly focused on is these deep alluvial soils that are characteristic of the Central Valley, essentially infilled by the 2 mountain ranges that are on both sides of California. And that created layers of topsoil that range from anywhere from 5 feet to 15 to even 100 feet, so 3 meters to 30 meters, allowing us to farm trees and other, not just almond trees, but other fruit trees very successfully. That then is capped off by the fact that we have water reservoirs that essentially is making use of the snowpack, which is the largest water reservoir in California that's within the Sierra Nevadas, that helps slow the release of that water, and then canal systems that distribute it across the state. This ranges across it's about an 8-hour drive from top to bottom of the valley. So you're really looking at somewhere around 500 miles, about 450 to 500 miles, just under 800 kilometers of the Central Valley. And it's about 60 miles wide or 100 kilometers wide and going up and down the state. So across this, we have a wide variety of crops. Somewhere around 250 crops are grown in the Central Valley, but almonds have kind of made their way to the top. And that's just due to the economics. So we flip that back around and we look at farm scale, and what's unique about the almond industry as well as other specialty crops within California is that we have relatively small farm sizes able to maintain profitability. So we see the average farm size being around 85 acres across the industry. So that's roughly about 32, 33 hectares. And there's about 7,000 to 7,200 almond farmers that are farming ground. Now, as I mentioned, that's the range, but we do have farm sizes well into 10, 12, 13,000 acres, so 5,000 hectares. And that extends all the way down to the small size where we have farmers that are also farming 5 to 10 acres of almonds, so 2 to 4 hectares of almonds. So gives you an idea that we're working across the scale when we're farming almonds. And most of this is based upon the infrastructure and historical precedents that we have. So we have the ability of contractual services to help with harvest and labor and processing, and that has allowed smaller farmers to have a little bit of an edge in comparison to the rest of the world to kind of keep a leg up and able to farm successfully. Now they're not doing it full time, but they are able to do it as a little bit of an extra income in those situations. We tend to see if you want to make a living farming almonds, you minimally need somewhere around 85 to 100 acres of almonds, and you're tending to farm pretty thin on the labor component. So that's usually 1 or 2 people that are maintaining that as a full-time position and using that as an income for their livelihood. And of course, that's dependent upon price. So it just kind of gives you an idea that, you know, this farming is not all about giant corporate farms. This, you know, we deal with a lot of small acre farmers, with the majority of farmers being under 50 acres or less. Now, going on to regulations, it's been ever changing. I think if you talk to a lot of farmers, they tell you it's getting a little bit more challenging to do what they do. And this includes everything from, as Dr. Detwiler mentioned, food safety, to dust, to reductions of water, as well as greater tracking of water resources being applied to the field, nitrogen regulations, labor regulations, as well as chemical regulations or pesticide regulations on top of it all. So these tend to be changing relatively quickly, and sometimes even faster than I think many of them can adapt or adopt. But it is something that is a threat when we farm within California, just due to the large amount of population that we have in the state, and as well as being protective of both the environmental resources we have. So there's a wide variety of these ranges. Now, looking more specifically into water, we're relatively fortunate in comparison to a lot of other places across the world that we generally have a relatively steady water supply. That may be hard to believe as we're kind of still recovering from this drought that we went through that was about a 7-year drought, depending on who you ask. But we generally have enough surface water to provide at least some irrigation water to most of the almond acreage across the state. And then farmers also have the ability to rely on groundwater to make up any shortages that may have occurred from these different or variable weather conditions. Now, that second part, or both parts, have been under a lot of scrutiny. One, there's been an increased effort to maintain flows down these rivers, what we call riparian flows, and that would require water to be released out of these reservoirs and reducing the allocations that are for farmers. So that would reduce the amount they can apply to the ground, which would then have a direct impact on how much they're able to farm or how much they're able to produce. The second aspect, and this is ongoing as well, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed a few years ago, and this is going to essentially limit the amount of water that can be extracted from the ground and prevent the declining situation of our aquifers. So underneath all the entire of the San Joaquin Valley, if you think of it like a giant bathtub, we have water that's kind of filled up the base, and we're living essentially on top of these giant reservoirs that are within the gravel and the sands. And farmers have tapped that water for the past 60 years to farm, especially in times of drought. And through that use, essentially overuse, using more water than we're getting recharge or water moving back into that aquifer, we're seeing that the aquifers are declining, as well as in some cases the soil is declining. We call that subsidence. It's actually sinking.
Right.
And so this regulation is to reduce the withdrawal of that water in order to bring these aquifers into stability where they're no longer declining, and then into eventual gradual recovery. And this is a regulation that's beginning to pan out and would be in full force over the next 20 years to allow farmers to adapt and essentially contract farmland in order to bring it into parity with the groundwater resources.
Thank you. So I want to key in and ask Dr. Detwiler to weigh in. David, you touched a little bit on consumer perception of farming and where their food comes from, and specifically consumer perception around almond farming, use of water. Dr. Detwiler, can you weigh in a little bit from your perspective on, how consumers, react and view, the farm industry, where they're getting their food from when there are pathogen outbreaks, or if you have any exposure to, questions about pesticide use and how people view that, or water consumption by farms?
Well, sure. And David had already brought up some really incredibly good points in terms of, there was a time not too long ago where the three items of concern were, in terms of food, how much did it cost? Did it taste how I wanted it to taste? And is there enough? And today, everything from environmental change to climate regulations and climate concerns, climate change, to immigration policy, land use policy, local versus state regulations, water quality. There's so many things that are not only of concern to the industry, but when you start looking at what consumers are asking for, and sometimes a trip to your grocery store is a good indicator of certain things. When you look at packages that have, whether it's country of origin labeling or GMO free or organic, or so many of these kind of qualifying badges, if you will, or phrases on packaging, companies would not put those on their packages and would not invest what goes in to obtaining those certifications, those meeting the standards and gaining those qualifications, if they didn't think that consumers cared about or even knew about those things. So yeah, people want wine from certain regions of California. People want walnuts or almonds or pecans, whatever it is, from California. They want, California is such an active source of so many foods that to get it from California is what a lot of people look for in terms of not only the highest of quality, but in terms of also brand reputation. And much more. Again, like I said before, when I look at the history of change in food and what consumers want, so much of what we look at in terms of meeting standards, regulations, and technology, even blockchain, is very much consumer driven and retailer driven. And even by saying retailer driven, it's still consumer driven, because what retailers want is usually along the lines of what their customers want.
Or else they go out of business quickly.
Or else they go out of business. Or again, that idea of why would they invest in making sure this information was known, was available, was labeled? I mean, even recently with the romaine lettuce, a trip to the grocery store would see that if you found romaine lettuce, there were stickers immediately applied to them that said, grown in California, made in California, or little teeny license plates that said California native or something like that on there. Again, someone said we need it, someone invested in those stickers, and someone said we have to put those stickers on there. They wouldn't have done that if there was this consensus that consumers didn't care.
And I want to add to that a little bit, and you're spot on with it. I mean, I think there's a lot of pride in what farmers do, especially in managing these regulations that they face. And it really has put farming, especially in California, to the forefront of the world. I mean, they put that sticker on there because we can tell you that the pesticide residues are checked. The amount of broad spectrum insecticides as well as fungicides being used are highly regulated and very minimal, if ever, because of the laws and regulations that occur in California. The labor conditions are better than probably in any other state, or especially if you look out of country where we're importing food from in South American countries. And so it is providing a little bit of a marketing edge, but often you don't really see a price difference between the lettuce that's grown in California or the lettuce that's grown in Chile or Argentina or Mexico. So the idea is, I think they're trying to get people to realize, hey, buy from us, help us get a little bit more stability in this pricing, because we are doing all these things, even though that's just hidden from the consumer, and it's all trying to capture in that label.
Well, I'd like to add that even though I'm sitting here in Boston, I'm actually born and raised in California myself. I think that the average consumer today is aware of the fact that California is a major driver of change, whether it be emission controls for vehicles,
Mhm.
whether it be agricultural standards, and so many other states, whether it be rapidly or down the road, do take direction from what gains are made in California. And one of the reasons why you were able to highlight that idea that what you see out of California doesn't necessarily cost that much more than what you get from Chile or from some other countries. Realize that you're also not paying for that in terms of the transportation costs and the shipping and the bill of lading and all the different customs and other issues as well. Getting things from California, it's not just about reputation. It's that idea of look what the value that's already in the product that people have come to know and respect.
So let me throw this question, keying off the same topics, let me throw this question to both of you. Could either of you speak to farmer sentiment about a desire to communicate more information to their consumers? I'm sure there's some concern that there's a lot of inside baseball in farming that perhaps consumers might misunderstand. But could either of you speak to sort of a positive sentiment among the farming industry? Like, yeah, we want to tell our consumers how much water we really use, or we want to correct this misperception in the marketplace. Help us do that.
Well, I think from a policy side, really quick, if we look back just 6 years ago at the spinach outbreak, the leafy green industry took a major hit, not only from the specific companies that were at the center of that outbreak, but the entire industry suffered a significant economic blow. And so, the Leafy Green Marketing Association, the idea of many of these smaller farmers in California and in other states as well, coming together in terms of whether it be training, whether it be marketing, whether it be the standards they reach, there's a very strong consensus. And even what David was talking about with very much the smaller farmers within the nut industry, it's not that impact is isolated. If one farm is impacted, the entire industry is impacted. So that idea of working together, finding what elements are, there doesn't need to be competition. There doesn't need to be an us versus them. The idea that the entire industry is looked at, and a lot of it comes down to people are, quite honestly, from my perspective, we're lucky if people know in most cases that their food, let's say, comes from California. Beyond that, no one's going to know what specific farm or what specific company their product likely comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So it is that entire industry, and in many cases, like with California, the entire industry within a state that would take a hit. And so that, from a policy side, is I think an accurate reflection of what consumers are looking at in terms of not only state, but industry and small farms.
Thanks.
I think from the farmer side, their concern is that there's lack of understanding of what actually goes on at the farm level. Less than 2% of the population in the U.S. farms, and when you actually look into the specialty crop sector, it's much less than that. So we're essentially having 6 million people produce the food for over 300 million people in the country of the U.S. as well as around the world. So with that, there is this fear that people just won't understand. They don't have the training or the basis of understanding. A good saying is, are pesticides good? Most people will tell you pesticides are bad. And that has what's kind of spurred a lot of the movement into organic production as well as organic preference at the supermarket. But most people don't know that organic systems spray pesticides too. It's just a different type of pesticide. It's how it's made. It's not a synthetic pesticide and so forth, or it's derived from a biological agent. So there's these components and these myths that kind of swirl around, and I feel that there's I feel, as well as many others, that there's just a general lack of understanding of what does it mean to work into a native system or into a natural system. It's relatively an artificial system that's tied into farming. Farming has always been about introducing a crop that's not necessarily grown in that area and then produce it on a lot larger scale in order for a few to feed the many.
Right.
With that come a lot of practices, because you have to manage different diseases and insect pests and outbreaks because of those different ways of growing whatever it may be, whether you're doing a monoculture or a diversity of of crops grown across a small area, there's always problems that tend to persist. So with that, I think there is a little bit of fear about saying, well, what are people going to think, especially if that data has the lack of curation needed to bring understanding to the masses. But at the same time, there's also a sense of pride because many of them work really hard to strive to reduce the amount of resources they're applying to their field. And whether that means water or fertilizer or pesticides or trying to reduce deaths, because one, they want that property to be something they can pass down to the next generation. So they want to maintain the integrity of the land. They also want to make sure that the people who eat their food are safe. They don't want to hurt anybody. They're just like anybody else. They're just doing their jobs. And two, they want to be good stewards to their community. So they don't want to create pollution and other issues that tend to cause problems down the road, just across the road or into the local town, as well as the air we breathe in the valley. So there's a lot of pride of the steps and the strides they're taking. And many of the regulations that we actually look at now that tend to have these large precedences and headlines is due to many cases, sins of the past, in which farmers didn't know because the research wasn't conducted. And over 50 to 60 years ago, things have changed and we've progressed to a greater level of efficiency. So I think they like to showcase that aspect of farming. They're just a little bit afraid that if things go a little bit uncurated without someone to help people understand why practices are done, that might get a little bit out of hand.
Well, that echoes a conversation I had earlier this week with some folks out of the Central Valley, that sense of pride among the farming industry and that desire to communicate and educate the end consumer about all of their good practices and the good things that they do. So that's really good to hear.
Yeah, and there's good and there's bad. I mean, I would say bad, but there's things they need to do in order to maintain production. And there's a lot of perception that would suggest that that's bad. In reality, it's what we need to do if we want to consume this type of product, regardless of where it's grown. If it's Australia, Spain, California, anywhere, certain practices are going to have to be employed to maintain production to keep the operation economical.
Right.
Well, and likewise, I'm in far too many conversations about certain topics, and I'm surprised that more farmers or more representations from farmers are not at these conversations. When we start to talk about quality, food safety, authenticity, defense, and even security or sustainability, I do think that that farmers definitely want to see that their product is going as far as it can, it's as safe as can be. But it's alarming when you see how much food waste we still have in America, how much we question, best by or used by or eat by or whatever dates on packages at the grocery stores. And when consumers are more focused on information on a box or packaging, that it's like, that's not even the right information you should be focusing on. You should be focusing on this, whether it be, the immediate needs or the long-term dietary considerations. I think sometimes there's too much talk in the food circles from these celebrity chefs and not enough conversation for the mainstream television viewer or Netflix documentary viewer from actual farmers themselves that people are really buying into.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the expiration date confusion because that happens to be a pet peeve of mine. I know in my household, I've seen a lot of food wasted with the misperception that after that date, the food turns to poison. Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of reading on that as well. And it looks like there's been some stalled attempts to clarify the labeling, right? Every now and then it comes back.
There is, and milk, I believe, is the only one, unless something recently changed. Milk is the only thing that's heavily regulated in terms of those dates. Most other dates you see are actually dates pertaining to when it's supposed to be rotated off of the shelf at the grocer's, at the grocery store,
right.
And so that another product comes in, kind of a deal. Almost like keep this sign up for this movie until this date, and then put up another sign in terms of crackers on the shelf or nuts, in a bag on the shelf, kind of a scenario. And yet we think of it, oh no, it's going to expire tomorrow, got to throw it out. And yet there was nothing wrong with that dry good or whatever it is.
Yeah. Thank you. Just changing gears and sticking with you, Dr. Detwiler, you had mentioned blockchain and obviously that's close to our heart here at Pavo. Could you just speak a little bit to, why you're seeing that's important in the food industry and how that's going to help consumers and the whole supply chain?
Sure. I see blockchain as being something that, we're in a day of age where trust has been lost in many areas, and people are asking questions about trust. And a lot of it it has nothing to do, I think, with farmers. So I don't want to go down that road with a perception of thinking that I think the trust has been lost with our farmers. I think the consumers, we've grown farther and farther away from the source. We are not close to the source of food anymore. We get food from other states, from other countries. We don't even get raw agricultural products anymore as much as we get partially, if not completely, commercially packaged goods, ready to eat foods. We eat out. Heck, sometimes people even go to the grocery store and eat there at the grocery store when they have hot and cold service right there at the grocery store.
Yeah.
So as we've grown farther and farther away from the source, we've lost track with that information, with that ability to trust. Meanwhile, most of our trust has shifted to be online or digital. We would, before we would ask a neighbor or a family member, we will go online and look at a Yelp review or an Angie's List or a Better Business Bureau rating from a complete stranger on a hotel or a computer or a car or a restaurant. We want to see these elements of validation. Looking for validation, whether that be word of mouth or in digital form, I think blockchain is what people are looking at in terms of helping to provide some of that necessary modern, I wouldn't say futuristic, but modern technology solutions to the dozens and dozens of documentation that's needed, whether, again, food safety, food quality, authenticity, auditing, standards being met, the qualifications of those auditors, climate analysis, chain of control from farm to fork. There's just so many elements involved that are generating so much paperwork. And then all of a sudden you get to your grocer or restaurant, and our laws really only right now provide for a one-step back kind of access to information.
Right.
And people want more than that today. They don't want to see necessarily all hundreds of pieces of paper, but they want more assurances that this documentation does exist, that there can be ease and trace back should there be the need. But everything from where did this come from to was this manufactured in a peanut-free, no offense, environment or some other allergen, to is this actually the fish that I am ordering? People really want to know that today. People are asking those questions, whereas 25 years ago, people were not asking those questions. When I was a kid 25 years ago, the question was, what toy was in the cereal box? That's all I need to know.
Yeah.
All right, maybe more than 25 years ago, but you get the idea. We ask different questions today, and it's not rare that we ask these questions. And I think that's where blockchain comes in.
Which, on that note, I'm going to date myself and make a reference to the California Dancing Raisins.
Sure.
Anybody in our audience that's watching, if you want to go look that up on YouTube, you'll find some of the old ads. David, could you, and I'm just keeping an eye on the time too, David, could you speak a little bit specifically around farmer sentiment around technology adoption towards closing that gap between, this is something I think many of us know, in the United States in particular, we're becoming a more urban population and less rural. We've lost that agrarian sense. But David, could you speak a bit to farmers' sentiment around technology adoption? How can they close the gap and bring people back to the farm in a sense?
Well, I think that's a really good question. In some cases might be a little bit loaded, but generally the sentiment towards technology is favorable. It maintains, as long as it helps them increase efficiency, so whether it reduces labor or leads to an increase of productivity or an increase in price, I think there's a lot of interest in that. So kind of first dials back down to the economics of adoption. And that makes sense. These farms are businesses, and I think sometimes we forget that these farms have to make money, otherwise they can't make their land payment, they can't pay back for the seed or the trees or the development expenses, and that leads to bankruptcy and farm failure, just like any other business, whether it's a restaurant or a grocery store. So now, looking towards kind of this transparency, I think there's a phenomenal opportunity to allow people to have a better understanding of what's going on at the farm by having better transparency all the way through the system. And there's been some models that have been developed depending on, if you just very simply, the country of origin labeling that we mentioned earlier. If you look to more sophisticated systems in Japan, they have the ability to track back produce in a grocery store to that farmer, where you get a little bit of a bio about that farmer, where it was produced, and general conditions of that area. So I would only imagine that having the ability to trace back, at least with some farmers who are very proud of what they do and who are doing a lot of things right, to show that the labor conditions are positive, the growing conditions are positive, they're doing what they can to reduce pesticide use, they're applying the proper amounts of water and fertilizer. I think it would allow farmers to move a little bit from this price taker scenario to potentially a price maker, which would help pay for all the different recording that would be required in order to have that transparency.
So I think I really want to make note, we kind of get in our bubble here in Silicon Valley, and I think folks, every time the new iPhone comes out, they think of all that as technology. But I mean, farmers have always been technology adopters. I mean, the yoke, right? The plow, that is all technology that had to be invented or created by somebody.
Well, and on that note, students in food compliance and other areas within the food industry today at Northeastern, they're not just learning about food or laws or science, they're learning about geospatial intelligence, they're learning about blockchain, they're learning about drones and satellite imagery. They're also learning about data collection, data management, data security. But I think what's most important is perhaps that element of taking data and turning it into actionable information. Knowing what are the right questions to ask, knowing what consumers are wanting, know what the industry is expecting, and being able to make that shift again from data to information. Otherwise, it's useless. It's useless data.
And I think that's where the bottleneck is on a lot of these operations. They have the ability to collect all this data. Now, how can they get it processed or to the point to answer a question that they may be asking? And we've still struggled with that, even especially crops which tend to be a lot higher profitable systems in comparison to agronomic crops that are farmed throughout the U.S. We still struggle saying, okay, I got soil sample reports, I got leaf tissue analysis, I understand what's in my water. Now I'm looking at soil sensors in the field, I'm looking at sensors in the tree, and I'm looking at geospatial data coming in from drone or Landsat 8. Now, what can I do with this? How can I bring this together? And there's just not an interface that allows a farmer to integrate this across these different technologies. So essentially, there's no technology agnostic program that they can use to pipe all this in and help them spit out answers. And many are working to try to actually create this on their own through a variety of different tools and techniques. And I think it grows, there is a sense of frustration that there's just not something there where they can plug in what they want and add on things that they may need.
Well, and I think the frustration is because it's not exactly as if artificial intelligence or machine learning is going to be the solution, when there's nothing wrong with consensus and collaboration within the industry in terms of how can we best utilize this data, turn it into information, and make actionable decisions based on that are going to help not only the individual farm, but the industry as a whole.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks. So we're coming up about the end of the time we had set aside this morning. Let me just close off with one final question. I'll invite both of you to respond. David, perhaps yourself first. Could you just speak to, and this is forward-looking, speak to where you see more research or more technology investment being done from your perspective? Is it about more academic research, more academic work? Is it about more companies like Pavo bringing technology to the forefront? What do you see?
I think it depends on the question. There's things that you need research to help, academic-based research or in-field research to solve. I mean, you can't solve that when technology can't necessarily provide a solution to a problem that maybe is a little bit undefined. And once you kind of get your arms wrapped around that problem, then you can start looking at solutions that are available, whether that's a chemical or whether that's better monitoring or a better visualization of when that problem is starting to come into the field. And that's where I think technology can kind of step in. So I think these things come hand in hand. This isn't Technology is going to solve all the problems in the world. No, you need the fundamental background moving into the development of the technology to make sure that it's providing essentially a scientific-based solution to the question at hand.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Detwiler?
It's easy for me to say that he said exactly what I was going to say, but that whole mentality of let's not do anything until blockchain is verified and validated is, I think, an unethical option because it's just one tool that is meant to be used by those who have the skills to be able to do what's necessary with it. If blockchain is one day adopted by a company and they don't have the infrastructure in terms of the data collection and the data management, or they don't have the ability to analyze this data like we talked about before, or you have executives that don't see beyond the quarterly profit statement in terms of the long-term needs, whether it be for the stock owner, the company, the industry, the commodity, or even the consumers, it's not going to have done anyone any good. And history tells us that we can put a lot of technology into things. It doesn't necessarily amount to the best of outcomes. We have to consider the true burden of disease. We have to consider not only consumer preference, but we also have to consider the needs of the industry. And those industry needs are going to change from state to state, even from places within a state to other places within a state, because of the wide range of other factors that impact it. So again, I think consensus and collaboration are probably going to be more important tools than blockchain itself, but we need to have blockchain in order to bring us to the current technology opportunities that we have today with everything that we're dealing with on our table for documentation and information.
So yeah, boiling that down, I mean, the blockchain technologies is a key component and an enabler that has to come along with a lot of other social dynamics or corporate.
Well, I think we'll see that, imagine a company that's being sued because of when everything went wrong, and the question in a courtroom comes up in terms of why weren't you using the most up-to-date available technology? Why weren't you using blockchain? Why weren't you doing this when you could have been doing this? I think that's going to be the question going forward.
Great. Okay. We're about at the end of the time that we set aside for our webinar this morning. I want to thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedules. And again, for our audience, we are going to get this up on YouTube and just remind you of the PavoCoin website, www.pavocoin.com. Dr. Detwiler, thank you. David Dahl, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.